How does a tiny team, no money, no real factory, an engine borrowed from someone else, discover the greatest driver in the history of the sporting, and then lose him before he finishes a single race? The answer involves a man sitting in a prison cell, a lie about a racetrack, and one missing word in a contract. This is the story of a team that ran out of a converted carpet warehouse, a team built by a man who failed as a racing driver and trained, of all things, he was a bank clerk. A team that, for 15 wild years, kept punching the giants of Formula One right in the mouth and somehow kept getting back up. This is the story of Jordan, and it begins with the most unlikely team owner the sport has ever seen. His name was Edmund Patrick Jordan. Everyone just called him Eddie. He was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1948, and nothing about his early life said Formula One. As a teenager, he briefly thought about becoming a priest. His family pushed him toward dentistry. He rejected both, took a short accountancy course, and ended up exactly where no future motorsport legend is supposed to end up, behind the counter of a bank as a clerk at the Bank of Ireland. And that's where the story takes its first strange turn. In 1970, a banking strike back home left Eddie out of work for the summer. So he traveled to the island of Jersey, picked up odd jobs to get by, and stumbled onto something that would change his entire life. Go-kart racing. He was hooked completely. The moment that strike ended, he went home, bought himself a kart, and threw himself into the sport. And it turned out the bank clerk could actually drive. In 1971, he entered the Irish Kart Championship and won it. From there, he climbed Formula Ford, Formula 3. To fund it all, he hustled, famously selling carpet offcuts at a market stall in Dublin to pay for his racing. That detail tells you everything about Eddie Jordan. He was never the richest man in the room. He was always the sharpest, but a racing career needs more than sharpness. In 1976, a brutal crash at Mallory Park broke both of his legs and forced him out for a full season. He came back, won the Irish Formula Atlantic title in 78, but slowly a hard truth was settling in. Eddie was good. He was not great, and in racing, good doesn't pay the bills. Sponsors liked his charm, but not his results. So at the end of the 1970s, he made the smartest decision of his life. He got out of the cockpit eyes and started running the team instead. He called it Eddie Jordan Racing, and almost immediately, he revealed a gift that would define everything that came next, an eye for talent that bordered on supernatural. Look at the drivers who passed through Eddie's little operation in the 1980s. In 1982, he handed a test to a quiet young Brazilian named Ayrton Senna. The year after, his driver Martin Brundle went toe-to-toe with that same Brazilian in one of the greatest Formula 3 title fights ever seen. Senna versus Brundle, wheel-to-wheel, all season long. Then came Johnny Herbert, who won the British Formula 3 title in one of Eddie's cars, and in 1989, the team graduated to Formula 3000, the final step before Formula One, and won the championship at the first attempt with a fiery young Frenchman called John Alesi. And here's where Eddie's real genius showed. When a bigger team came knocking for Alesi mid-season, Eddie didn't just let him go, he sold him and pocketed a small fortune in the process. This was the pattern. This was the man. He could spot a champion before anyone else, and he always made sure he got paid. By 1990, Eddie Jordan had decided he wanted the big stage. Formula One. It was an insane ambition for a team his size. He set up shop in a converted warehouse near Silverstone, hired a brilliant young engineer named Gary Anderson to design the car, and bet everything he had on a single roll of the dice. And then there's a detail almost too good to be true. The car was originally going to be called the Jordan 911, but a certain German sports car company, Porsche, objected to a team using a number they considered theirs. Eddie was forced to rename it. The car became the Jordan 191, and according to Eddie himself, a story he loved to tell, Porsche even sent something his way to make up for the trouble. When the covers came off the Jordan 191 in 1991, the entire paddock went quiet. Gary Anderson had designed something stunning. To this day, it's regularly called one of the most beautiful cars in the history of Formula One, and it wasn't just pretty, it was fast. The team made its debut at the season opener, the United States Grand Prix in Phoenix, Arizona, With such a packed grid that year, small teams had to pre-qualify just to make the field, and right away, the little Irish team showed it belonged. The first points came soon after at the Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal, 4th and 5th place. A double points finish for a rookie team. Eddie Jordan had arrived, and by mid-season, with a striking car, smart sponsors, and growing buzz, Jordan was the talk of the paddock, and then everything changed because of a fight in London over a taxi. One of Jordan's drivers was a Belgian named Bertrand Gachot. He was quick, he was scoring points, and then, in the middle of the season, he got into an altercation with a taxi driver in London and sprayed him with a defensive gas spray. The consequences were severe. Gachot was sentenced to prison. Just like that, one of Jordan's race seats was empty. Right before one of the biggest races of the year, the Belgian Grand Prix at the legendary Spa-Francorchamps. So there's your man in a prison cell. And Eddie Jordan, never one to waste a crisis, suddenly had a vacant seat in a Formula One car and a paddock full of people who'd pay handsomely to sit in it. Eddie's first choice was an experienced Swede, Stefan Johansson. But Johansson wanted to be paid, so Eddie looked elsewhere, and the phone calls started coming in. The most persistent of them came from the manager of a 22-year-old German nobody, a sports car driver for Mercedes with zero Formula One experience. His name was Michael Schumacher. Now, Eddie had one big worry. Spa is the most demanding circuit in the world. Did this kid even know the track? So he asked, and Schumacher's manager, Willy Weber, looked him in the eye and said, quote, "Michael knows Spa. He's driven it about 100 times. It was a complete lie." Schumacher had never driven Spa in his life. But Eddie wasn't only interested in the kid's experience, he was interested in the money. Mercedes agreed to pay around $150,000 for the privilege of putting their young star in a Formula One car. And Eddie later admitted something brutally honest in his own autobiography, that if he'd known Schumacher had never been to Spa, he probably would have picked Johansson instead. What Eddie didn't fully understand yet was just who he'd signed. With no one to show him the track and no fancy hotel booked, the team actually stayed in a youth hostel. Schumacher did something nobody expected. He pulled a little fold-up bicycle out of the boot of his Mercedes road car and pedaled around the entire Spa circuit, learning every corner himself, and then he went out and stunned the world on a track he'd never raced, in a car he'd barely driven. Michael Schumacher qualified seventh. He beat his vastly more experienced teammate De Cesaris by nearly a second. The entire paddock turned and stared. The race itself, it lasted barely a few hundred meters. His clutch failed on the opening lap, and his debut was over almost before it began, but it didn't matter. The message had already been sent. A star had just been born in a Jordan, and that is exactly when Eddie Jordan's problems began, because when you discover something this special, the sharks come circling. And there were bigger sharks than Eddie in these waters. Here's the missing word in the contract. Eddie Jordan believed he had Schumacher locked down for the future. He believed they had a deal. But what actually existed between them was not a binding contract. It was a letter of intent, and in that letter lay a fatal flaw. A rival team had noticed. Benetton, run by the ruthless Flavio Briatore, and his engineering chief, Tom Walkinshaw, looked at the paperwork and saw the gap. Schumacher, they argued, had no binding contract with Jordan at all. He was, in effect, a free agent, and so just days after that sensational debut at Spa, Michael Schumacher was committed to Benetton. Eddie took it to court and lost. Because you can't enforce a contract that was never truly signed. At the very next race in Italy, Schumacher lined up in a Benetton. In his first race for his new team, he finished 5th and outqualified his teammate, the 3-time world champion Nelson Piquet. The kid Eddie discovered was gone, and he'd go on to become a 7-time world champion for another team. Now, most people would call this a disaster. Eddie Jordan turned it into a masterclass because the deal to release Schumacher came with a price, and Eddie made sure the money flowed in his direction. But there was one more piece on the board. Roberto Moreno. To make room for Schumacher, Benetton had to dump their existing driver, the Brazilian Moreno, And Moreno didn't go quietly. With some quiet advice from Eddie himself, he filed a legal injunction against Benetton. On the eve of the Italian Grand Prix, suddenly everyone needed a deal. Bernie Ecclestone, the most powerful man in the sport, hauled everyone into a hotel in Italy to, in Eddie's words, bang some heads together. Moreno was being offered $500,000 to drop his case, and who was whispering in his ear telling him to hold out for more? Eddie Jordan. When the dust settled, Moreno ended up driving for Jordan. Schumacher was at Benetton, and Eddie had somehow extracted money from nearly every direction in the whole affair. He'd lost the greatest driver of his generation and still come out ahead. And why did Schumacher's camp turn so cold on Jordan so quickly? According to several accounts, it came down to two words: Yamaha engines. Ecclestone knew Jordan was about to switch to heavier, slower Yamaha power for the following year and made sure Schumacher's people knew it too, steering the prodigy toward a faster car. So how did Jordan's miracle first season end? Despite losing Schumacher, despite the chaos, they finished fifth in the World Championship. Fifth in their very first year, ahead of teams with decades of history and 10 times the budget. It was the best season Jordan would have for years because the hard times were coming. That Yamaha engine Ecclestone warned everyone about, it was every bit as bad as feared. 1992 was a slog of breakdowns and frustration. The whole season produced a single championship point scored by Stefano Modena, sixth place at the Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide. From fifth in the championship to barely scraping 1 point, it hurt. For 1993, Jordan went back to basics with customer engines and gave a debut to a young Brazilian who'd become one of the most popular drivers of his era, Rubens Barrichello. The second seat became a revolving door. One driver, Marco Apicella, had a Formula One career that famously lasted about 750 meters before being collected in a first corner crash at Monza. But it was 1994 when Jordan started to truly find its feet. Barrichello was electric. He scored the team's first ever podium, third place at the Pacific Grand Prix, and then on a drying track at Spa, he grabbed Jordan's first ever pole position in the dying seconds of qualifying. The little team was growing up, and here's where Jordan became the team you probably picture in your head right now, because in the mid-1990s, a new sponsor arrived, Benson and Hedges, and with it came the color that defined them forever, that gorgeous, unmistakable bright yellow. There was a catch. Benson and Hedges was a tobacco brand, and many countries banned cigarette advertising. So Jordan got creative, disguising the name with a rotating cast of cartoon mascots and slogans: Buzzin' Hornets, Bitten and Hisses, Be on Edge. It was cheeky. It was clever. It was pure Eddie Jordan. By the late 90s, the yellow cars were becoming genuine contenders. A young, aggressive pairing of Giancarlo Fisichella and Ralf Schumacher, yes, Michael's younger brother, started collecting podiums. And then for 1998, Eddie made his biggest signing yet, a former world champion, Damon Hill, alongside new Mugen Honda engines. The season started badly. The car was difficult, and by the halfway point, Jordan hadn't scored a single point, but everything was about to change on one chaotic, rain-soaked afternoon in the Belgian forest. This little team from a converted warehouse was about to win its first Grand Prix, and it would be a day no one who saw it would ever forget. The Belgian Grand Prix, 1998, torrential, monsoon-like rain, and at the start, disaster. David Coulthard's McLaren lost control and triggered one of the most spectacular pileups in Formula One history, collecting around 13 cars in a single shower of carbon fiber. The race had to be stopped and restarted. When it got going again, more chaos. Michael Schumacher, dominant in the wet, crashed into the back of Coulthard while trying to lap him and stormed down the pit lane in a fury. The carnage cleared the way, and suddenly, improbably, both yellow Jordans were running first and second, Damon Hill in the lead, Ralf Schumacher right behind him. In the closing laps, the younger Schumacher was faster, catching his teammate. For a team chasing its first ever win, this was terrifying. If they raced each other, they could crash and lose everything. Hill got on the radio and laid it out plainly, quote, "If we race, we could end up with nothing. It's your call, Eddie." And Eddie hesitated, not from panic, but because he was checking exactly where Alesi, in third, was running before he committed. Then he made the call. Team orders. Ralph was told to hold position. Through gritted teeth, he obeyed, and Damon Hill crossed the line to give Jordan Grand Prix its first ever victory, a 1-2 finish, in their 126th race. Eddie Jordan danced in the paddock like a man possessed. Hill later described him as looking like a demented leprechaun. It was so unexpected that on the podium, the organizers played the wrong anthem, God Save the Queen, because the team was based in England, but Jordan raced under an Irish license. The mistake summed them up perfectly, the outsiders gate-crashing the establishment's party, but the best was still to come. For 1999, Heinz-Harald Frentzen joined the team, a driver discarded by Williams looking to rebuild his career, and what followed was the greatest season in Jordan's history. Frentzen was sensational. He won in France with a brilliant strategy call. He won again in Italy, and as the two giants at McLaren and Ferrari stumbled, the impossible started to feel real. With a few races to go, Heinz-Harald Frentzen, in a Jordan, was genuinely fighting for the Formula One World Championship, and then came the Nürburgring. Frentzen started from pole. He was leading the race. A win here would have thrown him right into the heart of the title fight with 2 rounds to go. And then his car rolled to a stop. The team announced an electrical failure, but the truth, revealed years later, was more human than that. Frentzen had simply forgotten to disable the car's anti-stall system after a pit stop. The car put itself into neutral. He thought it had broken, and he pulled off. When they got it back to the garage, it started first time. The team invented the electrical story to protect him from the embarrassment. As one insider put it, you win as a team, you lose as a team. Jordan still finished third in the World Championship that year, the best result in their history. But that moment at the Nürburgring was their Icarus moment. They had flown as close to the sun as they ever would, and from here, the descent began. The decline started with engines. Honda supplied both Jordan and a rival team, BAR, and made it clear only one of them would become the favored works team. The other would be left behind. It set off a desperate political battle, and in 2001, it produced one of the strangest episodes in the team's history. Heinz-Harald Frentzen, the man who'd nearly won them the title, was suddenly fired right before his home German Grand Prix. The reasons were never made fully clear. It was a brutal public split that shocked the paddock. Then Honda made its choice, and it wasn't Jordan. They threw their full support behind BAR and walked away. Eddie Jordan was offered a lifeline, sell Honda the whole team, but he refused to give up control. So Honda cut him off completely, forced onto customer engines, losing major sponsors, even tangled in a lawsuit. Jordan was sliding fast. And yet, in 2003, they pulled off one final miracle. At a rain-soaked, chaos-filled Brazilian Grand Prix, Giancarlo Fisichella found himself in the lead when the race was red-flagged and stopped. The win was first given to Kimi Raikkonen of McLaren, but days later, after an official inquiry, the result was corrected, and Fisichella was declared the winner. It was so confusing that Fisichella never even got to celebrate on the top step. He and Raikkonen swapped trophies at the following race. It was Jordan's 4th and final Grand Prix victory, a last defiant flash of brilliance from a dying team. The end came quietly. By 2005, the money was gone. Bernie Ecclestone introduced Eddie to a buyer, a businessman named Alex Schneider, and his Midland Group. 6 weeks later, the deal was done. Eddie Jordan sold the team he'd built from nothing for around $60 million, and on the day he signed it away, this tough, sharp, relentless dealmaker, the man who'd outwitted Mercedes, Benetton, and half the paddock, and sat down in his old office and cried. But here's the thing about Jordan. It never really died. The team was sold and renamed and sold again. Midland, then Spiker, then Force India, then Racing Point, and today that exact same team, operating from those same roots, races under a name you know very well, Aston Martin. And the story comes full circle in the most beautiful way, because years earlier, the greatest designer in Formula One history, Adrian Newey, once walked away from a team for a very specific reason. He said, "When a team starts being run by an accountant, it's time to leave." And yet decades later, it was Eddie Jordan, an accountant, who managed Newey's career and helped broker his move to Aston Martin in 2024. The very team Eddie had founded, the accountant who discovered Schumacher delivered the greatest engineer alive to the team he built from a carpet warehouse. The circle, complete, Eddie Jordan passed away in March 2025. He was never the richest team owner, never the most powerful, but across 15 impossible years, his little yellow cars discovered champions, beat giants, and brought a swagger to Formula One that the sport has never quite replaced. Rock and roll, defiant, brilliant. That was Jordan. That was the man who proved you don't need the biggest budget to leave the biggest mark.